James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. On first coming in sight of the French, we found their right wing resting on the heights of Frasne and their left stretching across the plain as far as the wood of Bossu. The latter skirted the right of the road from Brussels till it passed the village about 150 yards. But although it ran no farther in that direction, the wood extended a great way to the right, bounding numerous fields of wheat and rye, which lay between it and the French position, and which for some time tended to screen the enemy, not from our fire, but from our view. The ridge on which Quatre-Bras stands runs in some degree parallel to that of Frasne, but is not so high. Perceiving it to be the marshal's intention to obtain possession of the crown of the eminence at Quatre-Bras, our general dispatched the foreign troops into the wood of Bossu, and the 8th Brigade, the 28th, 32nd, 79th and 95th Rifles, under Major General Sir James Kempt, into the plain on the left to prevent the columns of the Marshal obtaining possession of the road leading to Ligny. In this movement, the 8th Brigade was supported by the 3rd Battalion Royals, 2nd Battalion 44th and 42nd Regiment, and the 92nd Regiment was ordered to line a bank on the right of the road leading from Quatre-Bras to Saint-Amand, on which the Field Marshal and his staff had taken post. The Brunswick infantry were stationed partly in rear of the left of the Highlanders and partly in the wood on the right of the village. The Hanoverian Brigade was formed on the left and rather in rear of the 92nd, and the Brunswick cavalry took post close to the houses of Quatre-Bras. The 8th Brigade moved down the slope of the eminence in beautiful order and commenced the grand struggle in fine style. But the numbers of that brigade formed such a striking contrast to those of the enemy that many of our oldest officers looked forward with uneasiness to the issue of the conflict. But the 16th of June was not the first day on which the gallant Kempt and his brave associates had met their enemies under similar circumstances. Nothing discouraged, therefore, by the numerical superiority of their opponents, they rushed to the combat with the spirit of lions, and after a dreadful struggle forced the foe to retire. In a quarter of an hour, the work of death was renewed on both sides with increased fury. As before, the enemy were again on the point of yielding, when Ney dispatched fresh troops to their relief. On perceiving the Marshal deploy fresh battalions towards our left, the Duke of Wellington gave orders to the Royals, 42nd and 44th, to take part in the battle. The French infantry, assisted by a powerful and well-served artillery and a numerous and highly equipped cavalry, displayed a considerable degree of personal bravery. Fancying no doubt that a few charges of the different arms united would either force their opponents to retire or place them in their hands as prisoners of war. Unsupported by any artillery or cavalry, however, save a few pieces of the former and the mounted corps of the Duke of Brunswick, our companions braved every attempt to penetrate their squares with the most unshrinking firmness, and invariably drove back the enemy with great loss. About 4 o'clock the Duke of Brunswick, at the head of his cavalry, passed the right of the 92nd Regiment to charge a body of French cuirassiers considerably in advance. Led by their undaunted prince, the Brunswickers pushed forward in gallant style and conducted themselves admirably, till, perceiving the Duke fall from his horse mortally wounded, the whole were seized with a panic and retired towards Quatre-Bras, hotly pursued by their opponents. This unfortunate affair gave the French a temporary advantage and inspired them with fresh courage. Elated with their success and seeing no troops in their front to arrest their progress, the enemy advanced with all the audacity of conquerors, conceiving, no doubt, that the battle was decided. The 92nd Regiment, hitherto kept hid from the view of the enemy, were now ordered by the Duke to be prepared to give them a warm reception. The orders of their illustrious general, who was then along with them, were obeyed with the utmost alacrity. Still keeping themselves out of sight of the assailants, the Highlanders permitted almost all the fugitives to pass to the rear, and then, starting to their feet, they poured a most destructive flank fire upon the French cavalry, who were rapidly advancing along the highway, and laid many of them in the dust. The survivors, not expecting such a reception at a point where they imagined resistance had ceased, fled in the greatest confusion. One of their officers, having advanced nearly to the houses before he discovered his danger, made an attempt to escape by the road on which the 92nd Regiment was posted. On turning the head of his horse to make a neck or nothing sort of a dash down the road, everyone imagined his object was to find a passage for his sword to the heart of our commander. First one mounted officer and then another perilled their lives to save that of their general, but their opponent neatly parried their cuts. All eyes were now riveted on the Duke, confidently anticipating a fatal result. In a twinkling, the officer was within a few paces of the field marshal, whose serenity on this, as on all other occasions throughout that day, was universally noticed and loudly applauded. He passed, however, without even looking at the Duke, on which our eyes again glistened with joy, but in order to prevent the hare-brained youth causing a similar hubbub amongst us, a few men of the 6th and 7th Companies, 92nd Regiment, fired at him, killed his horse, and wounded himself severely, a ball passing through each foot. He was instantly removed to the rear, and afterwards to Brussels, where, being quartered in the same house with an officer of the 92nd Regiment, he candidly acknowledged that his only object was to escape. Disappointed in his attempt upon the village, Ney again directed an attack against our extreme left. For some time his operations were all of an offensive character, and consisted of a multiplicity of attacks, sometimes with cavalry, sometimes with infantry, and not unfrequently with both, assisted in their murderous work by a numerous artillery. Having neither cavalry nor artillery to back their personal exertions, the 7 British infantry regiments found it necessary to throw themselves into squares, to sustain with effect the dreadful charges of their mounted opponents. In forming square, some of them were more expert than the rest, but with one exception, none of them sustained any loss but such as was occasioned by the fire of the enemy. Perceiving that the British had no intention of retiring or deploying, so long as they were surrounded with so many opponents, the French at length adopted the rather ticklish proceeding of galloping up to the muzzles of the British muskets, and endeavouring to provoke our men to throw away their fire by discharging their carbines and pistols into the centre of our squares, to which they were most anxious to find a passage. In this, however, they were most completely disappointed, for nothing could induce our companions to depart from a system which experience had clearly demonstrated to them was the best they could adopt under the trying circumstances in which they were placed. All the attempts of the enemy, therefore, to induce our soldiers to part with their ammunition proving fruitless, the French, irritated at their obstinacy, attacked our squares sword in hand, but were always forced to make a precipitate flight, leaving the ground around each square covered with their killed and wounded. About 5 o'clock another attempt was made to wrest Quatre-Bras out of our hands, but with no better success than the former. Soon after this, the Brigade of Guards, under Major General Maitland and 3rd Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Charles Alton, arrived to our assistance. Never did troops receive a more seasonable reinforcement. The Guards were thrown into the wood of Bossu, on the right of the village, and the 3rd Division moved along the road leading to Ligny, till they passed the Royals, etc., when they halted and formed the left of our line. As each battalion hurried past us, it was loudly cheered by every man in the Highland Corps. Yes, Tears of joy bade them welcome to share our perils and our glory, and our best wishes followed but too many of them to their last and silent abode. Leaning against a bank when the 73rd Regiment approached us, and unconscious at the time that I had the pleasure of being known to any member of that corps, I felt something like surprise when Lieutenant, a genuine Irishman, jumped out of his place and, grasping my hand as firmly as a vice, said, "How are you, my old boy? This duty is not quite so pleasant, I fear, as that in which you and I were engaged the last time we met at Athlone, devouring poldoodies and swallowing whisky punch." On admitting the fact, the warm-hearted Irishman flew like lightning after his battalion, promising to call on me and renew the conversation next morning. But alas, how little do we know what is before us. In an hour he was no more. As the 3rd Division proceeded along the road to their destination, the enemy were not very sparing of their shot and shell. Their tremendous salvos, however, we could but feebly return, having received but a slender addition to our original numbers. The enemy, conceiving that the troops composing the 3rd Division were those who had baffled their cavalry to obtain possession of Quatre-Bras, lost no time, after the rear of the division had cleared the village, in making the necessary preparations to renew his efforts to obtain the key of our position. Under cover of a heavy cannonade, Ney pushed forward 2 columns of infantry, one by the highway leading from Charleroi to Quatre-Bras, and the other by a hollow or kind of ravine in front of the wood of Bossu towards the same point. On the left of and fronting the road to Charleroi, 200 yards in front of Quatre-Bras, there was a house of 2 floors, from the rear of which ran a thick hedge a short way across a field. On the right of the road and immediately opposite to the house there was a garden surrounded with a thick hedge. In the face fronting the road there was a small gate, from which a gravel walk led to a similar one on the opposite side. The house and hedge were occupied by the enemy's advanced guard, and their main body, 12 or 1500 in number, had taken post about 100 paces from the rear of the garden, when the field marshal gave us orders to charge. The order was no sooner given than every man of the 92nd Regiment, about 600 in number, appeared in front of the bank, behind which they had reposed for 4 hours. Colonel Cameron, accompanied by General Barnes, the Adjutant General, advanced by the highway at the head of the Grenadiers and 1st Company. The other companies, by an oblique movement to their right, directed their march upon the same points, the house, garden and hedge, the enemy pouring on us a deadly fire of musketry from the windows of the house and from the hedge on the left of it, till we succeeded in driving them from both, which was not accomplished without a severe loss. Amongst the officers who fell at this time was the brave Cameron, who, on receiving his mortal wound, retired from the field, regretted by the whole regiment. But although we had forced the enemy to relinquish their hold of the house and hedge on the left of it, the principal part of our duties remained to be performed. Although their advanced guard had been driven back, the main body showed no disposition to retire. On the contrary, they poured on us showers of musketry, sufficient to appall soldiers of more experience in those matters than 1/2 of those who fought on the plains of Quatre-Bras. In fact, it required no little exertion to keep some of the young soldiers in the ranks, for perceiving the French so much more numerous than themselves, and that the garden hedge, though very thick, afforded them no protection, the danger appeared to some of them so very great that, but for their veteran companions and the attention of the officers to their duties, they might have been induced to retire. But from this disagreeable situation we endeavoured to extricate ourselves in the following manner. The only obstacle between us and the enemy being the garden, it was proposed to move a portion of the battalion round and between it and the wood of Bossu, another division round the left or lower side of the garden, and a third to open a passage for itself through the garden by entering at the front gate. Being of this party, We accomplished our task of forcing the gates with some little difficulty, for the fire of the enemy was truly dreadful, and we could not take any steps to render it less effective till the whole battalion could be brought to bear upon the enemy. At length, however, all the 3 columns arrived at their appointed stations. Seeing our friends on the right and left ready, we moved out at the rear gate and quickly formed in front of the hedge. On this formation being accomplished, the signal of readiness was given, when the whole joined in 3 hearty cheers, and then, with the irresistible bayonet in their hands, advanced to the work of death. Who is able to describe the feelings of the combatants at this momentous crisis? Who can paint the inward workings of every mind when the Highlanders advanced either to drive the enemy from the field or leave their mangled bodies on the plains of Quatre-Bras? Language is inadequate to do it. Suffice it, therefore, to say that for a few seconds the French appeared quite resolved to await our assault, but on perceiving that we really intended to close with them, they wheeled to the right about and attempted to escape by a hollow in front of the wood, along which their left column had previously advanced. As soon as they turned their backs, we poured in upon them a volley of musketry, which did great execution, and thereafter each man did everything in his power to prevent them effecting their escape, and so well did our lads do their duty that at every step we found a dead or a wounded Frenchman. Many of the latter affected to treat the whole business very lightly, whilst others, even in the very agonies of death, ceased not to echo the cry of their more fortunate brethren of "Vive l'Empereur." Never was the fire of a body of men given with finer effect than that of the 92nd during the pursuit of the enemy, which continued for fully half a mile, and until the advance of a corps of French cavalry rendered it prudent to retire into the wood of Bossu. In fact, before we parted, their column, at first so formidable in numbers, was reduced to a skeleton. This was the last serious attempt made by Ney to obtain possession of Quatre-Bras, but he continued to dispute the wood and various portions of the ground on the left till after 9 o'clock, when every prospect of victory having vanished, he withdrew his troops and left us in possession of the ground which they occupied at the commencement of the engagement. About 10 o'clock, the piper of the 92nd took post at the garden in front of the village, where, after tuning his chanter and setting his drone in order, he attempted to collect the scattered members of his regiment. Long and loud blew Cameron, but although the hills and the valleys echoed the hoarse murmurs of his favourite instrument, his ultimate efforts could not produce above a half of those whom his music had cheered on their march to the field of battle. Alas, many of them had taken leave of this bustling world. Many of them were then lying weltering in their blood in the fields or in the woods, and not a few of them in the farmyard of Quatre-Bras. Of 36 officers who went into action, 11 only escaped unhurt, 6 being killed or mortally wounded, 2 slightly wounded, and 17 severely. Soon after this, the 92nd Regiment retired behind the houses of Quatre-Bras to take a little repose after the fatigues of this memorable day. The other corps remained all night nearly on the same ground they held at the close of the conflict. The Field Marshal retired to Genappe. Immediately after the close of the battle, our light cavalry began to arrive in the vicinity of Quatre-Bras, and at an early hour next morning the whole of the army had arrived at points whence they could be readily moved to wherever their services might be required. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 16th, Napoleon attacked the Prussian army in its position at Ligny, with the right wing and centre of his army, together with all his imperial guards, and after a desperate engagement of 6 hours, in which neither party asked or gave quarter, Bonaparte, by one of those tremendous charges of his cavalry which on so many former occasions had commanded success, again secured the victory. The loss of each army was tremendous, but severe as the loss of the Prussian army was at Ligny, how much more would that loss have been increased, had not divine providence miraculously delivered their great leader from the hands of his enemies. On returning from an unsuccessful charge of the Prussian cavalry, the horse on which Blucher was mounted was wounded by a musket ball. Instead, however, of arresting the speed of the animal, the wound rather increased it, till it dropped down dead. Stunned with the fall, the veteran general could not remove himself from under the horse. With the animal above him, and only one Prussian officer near to render him assistance, Prince Blucher saw the enemy approach and even pass him. It would be worth a kingdom to know what passed in the breast of the illustrious hero on this trying occasion. The brave Prussian army defeated and annihilated, France again sole arbitress of the continent, and himself exhibited to the gaze of a Parisian populace as the prisoner of that individual who, above all men on earth he most detested, must have passed before his eyes as some of the consequences likely to follow in the train of his misfortunes. Fortunately, however, for himself, for his country, and for Europe, the prince was soon relieved from this distressing and, to him, humiliating situation. For on missing their leader, the Prussian cavalry instantly turned round and, like a torrent, rushed down upon their pursuers with such fury that a few minutes served not only to drive back the enemy upon their infantry, but to rescue the venerable warrior and place him once more at the head of his valiant followers. That concludes the 16th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.